The Question of the Ingolstadt Manuscripts, read by Daniel Sutep. This is an original Sherlock Holmes homage, written in the classic style of Arthur Conan Doyle. It is a new story, inspired by the worlds of Sherlock Holmes and classic Gothic literature. It was in the spring of 1896 that Holmes was consulted regarding a collection of scientific journals said to have belonged to one Victor Frankenstein of Geneva, a name known chiefly to those with a taste for the more speculative branches of early 19th century natural philosophy. The papers, we were informed, had been discovered among the effects of a deceased Swiss antiquarian and conveyed to London through discreet intermediaries. Their arrival produced a mild but unmistakable agitation within certain academic circles. The Royal Medico-Scientific Society, in particular, found itself divided between those who hailed the journals as a significant recovery and those who denounced them as an ambitious fabrication. The manuscripts were placed in the custody of Professor Lionel Ainsworth, a man of considerable industry and no small reputation, who announced publicly that the documents bore every mark of authenticity. According to him, they contained private reflections and experimental observations extending the controversial inquiries for which Frankenstein had once been censured. Opposition arose almost at once. Dr. Matthias Rook, a scholar of exacting temperament and sharp pen, published a brief but pointed critique in which he questioned the internal consistency of the later entries. The diction, he suggested, showed irregularities. Certain technical expressions appeared, in his judgment, premature. The dispute might have remained confined to journals and lecture halls had it not been for Dr. Rook's sudden death. He was found in his laboratory at King's College, overcome by fumes from a chemical apparatus he had been using to test residue upon one of the manuscript pages. The ventilation window had been closed. A retort lay shattered upon the bench. The coroner recorded accidental asphyxiation arising from miscalculation. The newspapers, less restrained, hinted at darker ironies. Frankenstein's name, they observed, had once been associated with perilous inquiry. It seemed an ill omen that a critic of his supposed journals should perish while examining them. Holmes read these accounts without visible interest. "What occupies me, Watson," he remarked, "is not the romance of the name, but the sequence of events." We were introduced to Professor Ainsworth in rooms crowded with folios and anatomical sketches. He received Holmes with scholarly impatience. "The controversy is regrettable," he said, "yet inevitable. Any recovery of magnitude attracts envy." "And the manuscripts?" Holmes asked. "Unquestionably genuine," Ainsworth replied. "The paper, the ink, the handwriting progression, I have examined them with care." Holmes requested permission to do the same. The journals were bound in worn calfskin, the earlier entries written in a tight, disciplined hand consistent with early 19th century style. The ink had faded unevenly. Marginal notes appeared sporadically. Holmes turned the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. "What of Dr. Rook's objections?" he inquired. "A matter of pedantry," Ainsworth said curtly. He was predisposed to skepticism. Holmes did not respond. Instead, he paused over a passage in one of the later entries where Frankenstein discussed galvanic excitation in language curiously assured in its terminology. "You will forgive my asking," Holmes said, "whether the journals were discovered complete." "Substantially so," Ainsworth replied, though his answer was fractionally delayed. Holmes closed the volume and rose. The following day, we called upon Dr. Rook's research assistant, a nervous young man named Ellery, who confirmed that his employer had expressed private doubts exceeding those published. He believed, Ellery said, that certain later sections had been altered, not forged entirely, added to. On what grounds? Holmes asked. Terminology, sir. He remarked that one or two expressions belonged to a later period of standardization. Holmes's eyes brightened faintly. And yet he proceeded to test the manuscripts himself. Yes, he said, residue analysis might reveal disparity in ink composition. Holmes requested access to the laboratory. The room bore the signs of recent disorder. The shattered retort had been cleared, but the apparatus remained. Holmes examined the gas tap with meticulous attention. The valve bore slight scoring, as though adjusted with unnecessary force. "The window?" he asked. Ellery indicated the sash. It was stiff in its frame. "Dr. Rook was meticulous," the assistant added. "He never conducted experiments without proper ventilation." Holmes bent to inspect the reagent bottles aligned along the bench. One label was smudged, another bore a faint ring at its neck, inconsistent with the others. "He had written to a colleague in Geneva," Ellery said hesitantly. "He believed interpolation likely. He intended to confront Professor Ainsworth privately." Holmes straightened slowly. "Indeed." As we left the laboratory, I remarked upon the singular misfortune that had attended Dr. Rook's inquiry. Holmes's reply was characteristically restrained. "There is a certain peril," he said, "in disputing a man's inheritance of glory." He said nothing further then, but I observed that his interest in the manuscripts had sharpened considerably. Thus began what he later termed the question of the Ingolstadt Manuscripts. Holmes devoted the next several days to a scrutiny so minute that I confess my own patience was sorely tested. The Ingolstadt manuscripts lay spread across our table in ordered sequence. Holmes arranged them not by binding, but by ink tone, paper thickness, and the subtle evolution of the hand. He consulted reference volumes from his shelves and sent, without explanation, 2 brief notes to a chemist of his acquaintance in Bloomsbury. "What you observe, Watson," he said, at last, tapping the margin of a later entry, "is not error, but confidence." The passage concerned galvanic excitation and employed a term whose currency, according to Holmes' reference works, did not become standardized until some years after the supposed date of authorship. "It is a trifling distinction," I ventured. "To a casual reader," Holmes agreed, "but not to a man who has lived within the literature of his period. Scientific language evolves with surprising obedience to chronology." He then directed my attention to the paper itself. The earlier gatherings possessed a faint bluish cast when held to the light. The later sections, though similar in weight, showed a marginally warmer tone. "Paper fibers differ subtly in composition according to region and decade," Holmes said. "The variation here is slight, but not imaginary." "Then you believe the later entries were inserted?" "I believe," Holmes replied carefully, "that they were written at a different time. Whether by Frankenstein or another remains to be determined." Our next interview was with Professor Ainsworth once more, this time in the presence of 2 members of the Medico-Scientific Society. The atmosphere was strained but civil. Holmes inquired with studied mildness into the circumstances of the manuscript's discovery. They were purchased as part of a larger estate among miscellaneous continental effects. Were they bound as we now see them? "Substantially." "Substantially," Holmes repeated. Ainsworth's gaze hardened. "I resent the implication." Holmes ignored the remark. "Did you conduct independent chemical analysis of the inks?" "I examined them with care." "With what reagents?" Ainsworth hesitated, then supplied a name. Holmes inclined his head. "Curious. My own test, conducted yesterday, revealed a slight disparity in oxidation between the earlier and later entries." The room grew still. "You conducted tests?" Ainsworth demanded. "With the owner's permission," Holmes replied. "The later ink responds differently to a mild acid wash. Its composition suggests a preparation not widely available until the middle decades of the century." One of the society members shifted uneasily. "It proves nothing," Ainsworth said quickly. "Frankenstein may have revised his journals in later life." "An interesting hypothesis," Holmes said, "though it presumes the survival of the author well beyond the dates implied elsewhere." Ainsworth made no answer. From there, Holmes turned the conversation to Dr. Rook's final days. "I understand," Holmes said, "that you met privately with Dr. Rook shortly before his death." Ainsworth's expression tightened. "He requested clarification. I obliged him." "And he remained unconvinced?" "He was obstinate." "Did he inform you that he intended to publish further objections?" Ainsworth's silence lasted a fraction too long. Holmes changed the subject abruptly and inquired after the transport of the manuscripts from Switzerland. A Swiss intermediary, one Herr Baumgartner, had overseen their shipment. Holmes interviewed the gentleman at his hotel that evening. Baumgartner proved forthcoming. "The journals were not bound when first I examined them. They were loose gatherings, some damaged. Professor Ainsworth requested that they be arranged before presentation." "Arranged," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, he wished them to appear coherent." Holmes thanked him and withdrew. On our return to Baker Street, he was silent for some time. At last he spoke. "Ambition, Watson, is rarely satisfied with partial relics. You suspect Ainsworth of interpolation. I suspect him of improvement." Holmes then turned his attention to Dr. Rook's laboratory once more. He had secured, through discreet channels, a small vial recovered from the bench and a scrap of the shattered retort. "The gas valve," he observed, "was tightened beyond ordinary use. The scoring suggests deliberate adjustment with an instrument." He demonstrated the motion upon a similar tap in our own rooms. Furthermore, the reagent bottle used by Dr. Rook bore residue inconsistent with its label. A substitution had been made. "You believe Ainsworth visited the laboratory?" I asked. "I believe someone aware of Rook's experiments ensured that a fatal miscalculation would occur." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Consider the position. The manuscripts, if authentic, secure Ainsworth's renown. If exposed as interpolated, they reduce him to ridicule. Rook had identified the very fault which renders the later entries suspect. He intended exposure. And the manuscripts are partially genuine?" Holmes' expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The earlier sections bear every mark of authenticity. It is the latter ambition that betrays the hand." He rose and rang for a messenger. "Kindly deliver invitations to Professor Ainsworth, Herr Baumgartner, the officers of the Society, and the necessary authorities." "You have reached a conclusion?" I asked. Holmes permitted himself the faintest smile. "The question of the Ingolstadt Manuscripts, Watson, is less about resurrection than about revision." He returned to the journals and closed them carefully. Tomorrow, he said, we shall restore them to their proper century. The final conference was held in the library of the Medico-Scientific Society, a chamber whose sober mahogany and high windows seemed well suited to the quiet undoing of reputations. Professor Ainsworth stood near the long table upon which the Ingolstadt Manuscripts had been arranged. Herr Baumgartner occupied a chair to one side, composed but attentive. Several members of the society were present, along with a representative of the authorities. I took my place beside Holmes, notebook in hand. Holmes began without flourish. "The question before us," he said, "is not whether Victor Frankenstein pursued ambitious lines of inquiry. The earlier sections of these journals establish that he did. Nor is it whether these documents originated in Switzerland. That point is sufficiently demonstrated." He placed one of the volumes gently upon the table. "The question is whether the entire collection represents a continuous record from the same period and hand." Ainsworth drew himself up. "I have maintained that it does." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You have maintained it with conviction, yet conviction is not chronology." A faint murmur passed among the assembled members. Holmes proceeded to separate the manuscripts into two groups. The earlier gatherings display paper fibers of a bluish cast consistent with continental manufacture in the first decades of the century. The ink oxidation is uniform, and the terminology reflects contemporary usage. He then lifted one of the later sections. These, however, differ subtly. The paper, though similar in weight, bears a warmer tone. Under chemical examination, the ink responds in a manner indicative of a preparation not widely circulated until some years after the date inscribed. Ainsworth interjected sharply. "Frankenstein may have revised his work." Holmes turned to him calmly. "That suggestion would require evidence of a continued life and laboratory beyond the dates recorded elsewhere in the journals. No such evidence has been produced." He allowed the point to settle. "More telling still is the language. In this later passage, the author refers to a galvanic principle employing a term whose standardization postdates the supposed entry by several decades. It is not an error one would expect from a man writing at the dawn of the discipline." One of the society members nodded reluctantly. Holmes continued, "These later entries do not constitute wholesale forgery. They are rather an interpolation, an attempt to extend the intellectual arc of the original author." Ainsworth's composure began to thin. "You imply I fabricated them," he said. "I imply," Holmes replied evenly, "that you improved upon history." A strained silence followed. Holmes now turned to the matter of Dr. Rook's death. Dr. Rook detected the discrepancy. He expressed his intention to subject the inks to chemical comparison and to publish his findings. He met privately with you, Professor. Ainsworth's jaw tightened. He was mistaken. He was inconvenient, Holmes corrected softly. Holmes then described the laboratory scene with measured precision. The gas valve had been tightened beyond ordinary use. The scoring upon it suggests deliberate adjustment with a tool. The ventilation window, which Dr. Rook habitually opened, was found secured. The reagent bottle on his bench contained a substituted compound, producing a concentration of fumes disproportionate to the experiment he intended. He paused. "These are not the marks of miscalculation. They are the marks of intervention." Ainsworth's hand trembled slightly upon the table's edge. "You have no witness," he said. "No," Holmes agreed, "but I have sequence." He stepped closer. "You learned that Dr. Rook intended exposure. You had already arranged the manuscripts into coherent volumes, supplementing their incomplete later sections with your own compositions. The prospect of public disgrace was intolerable. You visited his laboratory under pretext of further discussion. A small adjustment of apparatus sufficed." Ainsworth's voice rose, betraying at last the strain he had so carefully concealed. "You cannot prove I wrote those passages." Holmes regarded him with an expression almost of regret. "Your own marginal annotations betray you. In one of the later sections, a correction appears in pencil. The graphite composition corresponds to a brand manufactured in London within the past decade. It is identical to that found among your effects." Ainsworth said nothing. Holmes's tone remained composed. "You did not invent Frankenstein. You merely sought to associate your name indissolubly with his. The temptation to complete an unfinished legacy proved too great." The authorities stepped forward at a discreet signal. As Ainsworth was escorted from the room, he cast a final glance at the manuscripts. It was not defiance I saw there, but a kind of wounded pride. When the room had emptied and the journals lay once more in orderly stacks, I ventured a reflection. "It is curious," I said, "that a man should risk ruin for the sake of augmenting another's ambition." Holmes closed the nearest volume with quiet finality. "There are few inducements stronger than the desire to improve one's place in history, Watson," he said. "It is generally wiser to endure a modest truth than to manufacture a grander one." The Society resolved to preserve the authentic portions of the Ingolstadt Manuscripts with appropriate caution. The interpolated sections were set aside for examination as evidence. Thus concluded the question of the Ingolstadt Manuscripts, a matter in which no creature stirred from the grave, yet in which ambition proved sufficiently destructive on its own.